Okay, hello and welcome to today's live stream. We are live on Facebook. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andy Cotgreave. I'm technical evangelist at Tableau and co-author of the big book of dashboards. And it's going to be another exciting day. Now, if you know me, you might know I'm something of a data viz history nerd. In fact, I'm really excited today. How much of a nerd? Yes, I've got Menard on the wall behind me. I've got my Menard historical viz t-shirt, and I've even got my Menard mug. The thing that's most exciting about today is we're not going to talk about the cliched historical data vizzes. No Menard, no Nightingale, no Jon Snow. Instead, 6 incredible vizzes that you've probably not seen before. And in order to take us through this, we need a knowledgeable and skillful guest to talk about this. So I'm very pleased to welcome the one and only man behind Info We Trust. It's R.J. Andrews. I'm going to get R.J. to introduce himself in a moment and tell us about what we're going to talk about. But before we do, if you have questions, and we love questions, please type them in the comment box. We will keep our eye on all the questions and address them throughout the live stream today. But with that, RJ, hello. Thanks for joining us. Why don't you just briefly tell us who you are and why looking at historical data viz is really useful.
Howdy. Thanks so much for the great intro, Andy. My name's RJ. I'm a data storyteller based in San Francisco, and you can see a lot of my public data stories at infowetrust.com. I'm also the author and illustrator of a new book with the same title, Info We Trust. I've learned quite a lot from studying historic visualization. And I'm a really big fan of historic visualization, but not because I like looking at dusty charts. The reason I like looking at historic visualization is because we can learn so much from historic visualization. And if you think a little bit about the context in which historic visualization was created, you'll understand why. Historic viz was created with different tool sets, different data, different historical context. Yes, that's all true. But what was it created for? It was created for the same reason we create viz today. It was created by people who wanted to understand the world better. It was created by people who had too much data to manage. It was created for audiences that were essentially data illiterate. And so all of these sort of design constraints that they suffered under are the exact same ones that we have to grapple with. And so when you have when you're creating visualization to try to solve these information problems in a different context, you have different solutions that naturally arrive. And so we're going to see some of those solutions across the next half hour plus, and I'm just really excited to show you all of them.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we're going to grapple with some of that because I think the parallels or the threads that have continued through data viz in the last 250 plus years, it's amazing that so little has changed. Now, one of the things we've done here is we've titled this Design Secrets. We're going to look at 6 different visualizations that you've particularly fallen in love with, partly through researching your book. But before we do, design is this nebulous term. What are we taking design to mean in the context of this session?
Right. So design means a lot of things to a lot of different people, a lot of different communities. If you go on the design Wikipedia page, there's something like 60 different, forms of design. Before we think about design as a verb, I think it's important to think of design as a noun. And so what is a design? A design is some sort of plan. My home base as an engineer, I think of blueprints, how to make a thing, you create a design and then maybe hand that off to somebody and they're then able to go and make it. When you think about design as a noun, you don't often see machines creating designs. People create designs. People are designers. Now, we do have today computer design things, but that's a relatively new phenomenon, and that really isn't truly the spirit of the word. And so when we think about human design things, what I think a lot, and when you think about plans, what I think about is being thoughtful about something, about being intentional, about planning. And those are the things I think we're going to see throughout the examples today.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, let's get on with the first of 6. I'm going to share my screen, which we'll go with that. Timeless style is our first category, and we've got 2 visualizations to go on here. So let's first talk about linear chronology from William Playfair. Let's tell us about this.
Okay, so this is perhaps the last chart Playfair made before he died. So this comes decades after the Atlas and Statistical Breviary. But I find it completely fascinating. The reason I want to kick off with this one is because forget the fancy script text. Like, let's just look at it from an aesthetic perspective. And if you took away all the stains on this old piece of paper, you see something that is almost identical to a product that Google might serve us. So we have this incredibly bold rainbow color palette used to distinguish different categories. Now, if we go even further, you can see some really brilliant things. On the written vertically, you have different historical events, I think all important battles or wars that are important to the context of this data. You have this really fantastic timeline where each decade is fully listed, but then you only have the last numeral in each date going across, just making a very clean design. And then finally, if we zoom all the way into these lines, you can see that they're distinguished not only by color, but also their line style. So just an enormous amount of thinking into how this is designed. Now, again, we're talking only about the aesthetic sort of form right now. If we actually look at what this data is, it's different economic factors charted across decades. And what's really honestly weird and quirky and strange, and something I wouldn't recommend and something that we wouldn't do today, but it's just fascinating to see, is that this is a very strange, like, multi-axis chart, in that each of these quantities that are charted have their own unit, but they all use the same numerical scale. And so we don't do this today because it creates intersections that are meaningless, but it's just like sort of a very fascinating way of showing very disparate data on
that's interesting. And I can see he's annotated the axis label in line with where the line crosses the y-axis as well, which is a tiny but very powerful feature, right?
Yeah, it's rich with annotation and context, and something that you can really spend a lot of time with.
Yeah, and you like the legend on this as well, right?
I mean, it's really bold. It's really this explanation, which is something that you see a lot in historic viz, where you'll have both a title and maybe even a title block that orients you and plainly says, this is what this is. And so most of Menard charts do this. This is what this is, but then you'll have another explanation block, which might give the story. And how can you miss the explanation?
Sorry, it's something we see a lot, isn't it? People, as you construct a chart, you assume that everybody knows how to read it, but since you put every pixel on the screen, you have a view of exactly what's going on. And yeah, these Playfair and these old pioneers knew they needed to explain the chart very deeply. Brilliant. All right, this is great. And these are the kind of things you can rebuild in tools today, and they look pretty much the same. Anything else to say on this one before we move on?
No, let's keep going.
All right, let's keep going. So number 2, we're still in timeless style, and now you have accélération des traversées maritimes.
Right, and again, I want to this is Émile Chesson's from one of his albums Statistique, which is this colossally important and monumental multi-decade project by the French government, where they put out an atlas every year looking at a different statistical aspect of French society, culture, economy. This one from 1888. I don't want to read and translate the French. That's not important. If we look and zoom into the chart itself, yeah, of course. I mean, it's so great. Something that today we don't always do, but they include the data with the chart, which is great. But without even looking at, what is this a chart of? And this is something that is thoroughly modern, right? Almost 140 years ago. So we have this all the data is annotated. We have these these eye lines drawing us down, so you can maybe pick off the actual value from the x-axis. You have this incredible minimal color palette where you have two different shades highlighting this really nice regression. It's just I want to show this just to sort of jog people that out of the sense, that old Viz is sort of like, it looks old. Like, this doesn't look old. This looks like something that that is totally viable today. And I just love the form and the style of this. And when I first saw this, I was like, whoa. I mean, I had to double check, how old it actually was.
And what I particularly love about this is, you just mentioned it, the drop lines, right? Those drop lines, you would think, if somebody said to you, can you make a chart and put a drop line on every single mark on the chart, you'd be like, no, that would just look a complete hot mess. And yet somehow that use of the line being so thin and the color being faded out and the marks being so saturated black, it works, right? And back in the day before there were tooltips, people might have wanted to get the ruler and go down. And
today today we have a lot of power. One of those is the ability to create interactives, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they had powers we don't. And so one of the powers that historic creators had is that they worked with paper. So what does paper give you? Paper gives you printing on paper gives you often a much larger canvas. It gives you a higher resolution canvas. It gives you a canvas that you can make finer lines on. It gives you a canvas that you can print a wider area of colors on. So, again, the constraints were different, and that means that the solutions were different.
Yeah, it's amazing. You say that you can print with many different colors, but again, another thing I like about this is that there's only one color, right? And it's just so simple. Awesome. All right, so that's timeless style. Basically, the point being, what our pioneers were doing can still represent today and look absolutely, utterly modern. I totally agree. So number 2, we're going to go to almost everybody loves them. Everybody loves maps.
That's right.
Cartography is certainly nothing new, and that's nothing new to people, but the way people have been visualizing maps has been sublime. So let's take a look at 2 maps that you really think pioneered. And we're back to Emil. Tell us about this one.
So going forward with Chasson, these are travel time cartograms. And the idea is that they're using cartogram, a map which has been warped in some way to show some sort of numerical, some sort of maybe even statistical insight. And in this one, the map is being changed to show that the ocean is shrinking, that the distance between places is getting shorter and shorter. Not the physical geographic distance, but the travel time distance is getting shorter. And the best one is this, how long does it take to get from Marseille, France to Corsica? And you see that at one point it took all the way 44 hours, and it goes down to 15 hours. Why? Because from 1830 to 1887, we've made the transition from sailing ships to steamships. And so this is just, I think, an absolute marvel. Think about how you might, create this today with modern tools. It would have to be a completely custom solution. And when we have completely custom solutions, well, that's expensive and that's a barrier. Well, guess what? Back then, doing something completely custom wasn't as expensive. It wasn't as much of a barrier because so much work was hand done. So I love this one.
I totally agree. And so this idea of I'm going to draw a map, but distance is going to be time, not a physical distance. It's like, what? How did you even think about that? And you're dead right. If you're only armed with a pencil and you're a blank piece of paper, then you're only limited by. Well, you're not really limited. This is an astonishing one, and there's a bunch of different ones, examples in this page as well. And again, look, it's one color really, or it's a bit of blue to show the sea as well. Really smart piece of work. Do you own these books, RJ?
I don't own the set, but I do own I do own some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the putting together a full set is, kind of a lifelong endeavor.
Yeah. And an expensive one, right? So if everybody goes and buys RJ's book, then hopefully we can fund.
It is expensive, but who does own a complete set is David Rumsey, and he scanned the entire set and made all of these images online for free to everybody in super HD. So you don't have to own them to enjoy them.
That's great. So we are very grateful to him for that. Don't forget, if you're enjoying this, and if RJ or I say something that you disagree with or agree with or have a question, do put them into the comments box, and we'll keep addressing them. But we are in Sublime Maps. So how else can you show geographical data? What if you had data about theatres in Paris? It's Emile again.
Yeah, so this is the last Chaisson we'll look at, but it's one that that you really have to see. And so this one I will spend just a moment talking about the data. And what we're looking at is the different, each sort of mark is a different theater in Paris. And you can see that here we're using kind of a standard base map, and then we have a layer of statistical data on top of it. And as we zoom in, you'll see that this biggest sort of fan diagram is the Opera House. And you can see that we have ticket sales, and they go from one yellow pie wedge to another. And those yellow pie wedges represents years of the Paris Exposition. So during the Paris Exposition, you'd expect more people in the city, you'd expect ticket sales to go up. And so those boundary years, there's a lot of design intention here. You can see that the piece is anchored by them, and so they are the extreme values, but then they're also called out. And if you look even further, you can see that the red years in between have this average line, but the average line does not include the exposition years. Why? Because these are outlier years, and we don't want to throw off our average with these outlier years. Again, looking at the form, the bold colors, the way that the size of the year type actually changes based on how big the diagram is, the way that the years are angled, it's just rich with annotation. You can see that actual values are marked. It's just an absolutely fantastic, analytic map or thematic map. And the last kind of design point is that I think that the form of this sort of fan, there's some sort of metaphorical linkage to what the inside of a theater actually looks like, where you have a stage facing some kind of audience, in a semicircular fashion. I love this analytic map. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's amazing. When I first saw this, I thought the metaphor reminded me of a fan that you might wave as you are sitting in a sweaty Parisian theater in the summer.
Yes.
I love the bar chart on this as well, because that gives you can really see the outliers of the Paris shows as well. Just really nice stuff. And one of the things, one thing that fascinates me, one of the things I took away from your book, and as I've kind of studied this over the years, is we just take it for granted, right? We drag and drop things around. We build a line chart, we build a pie chart, and whatever kind of chart we do, and we just do it. It's given to us on a plate by incredible developers. And one of the things I've appreciated over the years, and I think your book does this as well, is, this is a craft, right? And anytime you are building a chart, you've got all this weight or this support of hundreds of years of people doing this pioneering work, thinking, well, how can we do this? How can we do this? And that's one of the reasons I love visualizing data, is just to think somehow all these ideas have developed into the point at which I can just do this kind of stuff barely without thinking. One other aspect, and the reason I bring that up is because one thing I really like about this is the transparency, right? Now, we just added that to Tableau fairly recently. You can make things transparent just by clicking a slider. But I mean, I don't even know how you printed transparency in these days. How did they make transparent things? Do you know?
It's beautiful. Yeah. And the other thing is, this Eden Theatre on the lower left that you're showing now, it's there's data missing. Maybe the theater opened in that year where it has this big spike. It has a big opening year, but there, there's a story there behind this theater, and that story is represented because because the data the data before what is it, 1883 isn't there. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, marvelous stuff. We've done a lot with Emile. Do you know much about Emile Chasson?
Oh yeah, we could have a whole nother hour on just Chasson and who he was and what he did. I mean, one of the ways to think about him is sort of a protege or inheritor of the legacy of Menard. So Menard developed quite a lot of techniques and left this incredible legacy behind that was enthusiastically championed by the French government. And so we have a lot of tools on our own, but a lot of us live fairly isolated sort of practices, right? Maybe we're the only one in our business who does data viz, or we're work on some sort of service desk. Whereas you can think the full force of golden age viz was supported by governments just supporting dozens of people working on this together. So So yeah, we could talk more about the historic context of Chasson, but I think we should get to
that's another one. I mean, I'm not familiar with Emile. I know some of the British battles that were happening at this time with William Farr and Florence Nightingale, maybe 30, 40 years earlier, and how governments were beginning to support the collection of data. But yeah, we'll have to do a whole other show on that. Thanks for all the comments so far about the way we're going through this. We love the fact that you're enjoying it. And some questions. Oh, we've got one comment. Somebody says, one friend has said, old vises can be a bit overwhelming and difficult to understand. What are your tips for reading old visualizations?
So give them the time they deserve. Why are they overwhelming? So when you have a real piece of paper, you can zoom in, just like we zoom in on a Google Maps, but you zoom in a little bit differently. You zoom in with your eye. And so you can think of an old viz as something that, that deserves patience and time. And so give it that. The second thing I'd recommend is you should, if you can, and I think you can, like you can actually print these out. And you can look at them on paper, on a piece of tape, on a table. And I've done that, and they really sort of come alive when they get off the screen, because these things are not meant to be looked at, at a tiny little 5-inch iPhone screen.
Yeah, I just 100%. That is the perfect answer. And I think the one, when we look at historical vises, we've got to remember these were written at a time when there were no distractions, right? What were you going to do? You were going to buy the book, buy the chart, and you were going to sit and look at it, possibly for hours and weeks and months, because you didn't have any TV or social media to distract you. So people would be happy to read a book. They would be happy to read a long newspaper. They would be happy to look at a chart for a long time. And as we think about, modern life, we're like, everything's got to be quick. But no, sometimes it can be slow visualization, and sometimes you can pack so much detail in. And anybody designing visualizations now, they have to think, what am I designing for? Am I designing for Twitter, in which case I've got to make something instantly understandable, then move on? Or am I designing something for a long read? One example, the Financial Times, they've put chord diagrams into their long read section of the newspaper. Now, chord diagrams are incredibly complex charts. You have to devote a significant amount of time to understand what they're showing you. But then, once the time's in, then you get the insight out. Also, Georgia Lupi, who's just been hired by Pentagram. Her work is very dense, and it's like an old visualization. It requires time. It often requires being printed out to understand. But once you get it, you get it. So it's a great question, but yeah, ultimately give it the time it needs. All right, let's move on. We are going to talk about the little things.
Oh yeah.
Called design details, tiny little things that make a big difference. All right, go RJ.
Okay, so this is perhaps the first stacked bar chart by Alexander von Humboldt. And what we're seeing is area in the big fat bars, and then population in the skinny bars, and they're categorized by empire. And so you have British Empire, French Empire, Spanish Empire. What I love about this is a small little design detail, is that when we look into the British Empire, we can see that the United States, the Republique des États-Unis, has broken off. And so when this chart was made in the early 1800s, we're a couple decades past the American Revolution. And so there's just this little storytelling flourish representing the American colonies breaking off from Mama Britain with this sort of broken bar chart. And I just love this detail because it's so human. It's something that maybe you don't see on first pass, but once you do, it just gives the whole thing life. You realize that a real person, made this design decision to do this, and just again, I'm just so enthusiastic for this.
Yeah, and it comes back to what you were saying about the maps as well. In that, with a ruler, a protractor, and a pencil, I can do this in 15 minutes. But to try and do this in Tableau or some other tool would be kind of complicated.
That's right.
Yeah, nice little flourish. Excellent. So that's Humboldt. Oh, we could talk about Humboldt for hours as well, couldn't we? But we got the time. Now, it's my favorite. He's my hero, Willard Branson. 1939. What was he doing that impressed you?
Yeah, so Brinton was, I think, the leader of a class of data visualization educators, and so this was a group of people who wrote textbooks, who trained governments, who trained businesses, and they sort of codified and democratized and proselytized all of these lessons that we learned from people like Chez Somme. Now, this is an example from Brinton's second book, and maybe, Andy, do you have a slide that shows us kind of what standard practice is today? So what we're talking about here is baselines, particularly non-zero baselines. And so on the left here is what we all know to be bad practice, which is emphasizing a non-zero baseline as if it was zero. Okay, in the middle, I think, is what standard practice today. So this is what you're going to find in most news journalism. What you're going to find in most tools is that you don't emphasize a non-zero baseline. But if we go back to Brinton, I think he recommends something which is better practice than our standard practice today. And that's something that you can call this a torn baseline or a wavy baseline. But what he does is he calls your attention, here it's 90%. He calls your attention that this is not a zero baseline. And he does that by making this wavy. Now, there's different ways you could call attention to it. Here we have sort of a wavy line. You could imagine a more jagged torn line. You could imagine no line at all, where it just empties out into nothing. And then, of course, he does, because this is a relative chart and we're looking at compared to 100%, he does emphasize that the 100% line with the darker line. Now, going back to like, what is design? What's a design detail? You can see how intentional this is. If he didn't emphasize that it wasn't a non-zero baseline, it might be possible to miss that there was a non-zero baseline. Doing it this way calls the viewer's attention to this aspect of the chart, and I think this is a best practice that deserves revitalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was very lucky. I got a copy of this book. Like here's the slide of the same page. It's just so beautiful, as you say. Looking at the actual printouts of these original charts, it's fills me with joy. Yeah, Brinton was amazing. If you haven't come across his 1914 book, which was possibly the first book ever written on data visualization techniques, I recommend you go find that go find that online. Because that's astonishing.
Yeah, both books are on archive.org. Yeah, and they're both worth reading cover to cover.
Absolutely. All right, keep going with the questions. We've got one. Well, let's take it now. Do you think there are any historical charts that were relevant then, but not now? We might. I don't know if we're foreshadowing anything there. Possibly not. So yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there are thousands and thousands of charts made. So most of them are irrelevant now. I mean, almost all of them would be irrelevant now in terms of why they were originally created. So yeah, I think most of them are probably irrelevant in terms of what story they're trying to tell, because they were created in their time to tell a particular story in their time.
Yeah, I think there's a great book, Cartographies of Time. Again, I'd highly recommend anybody who's interested in this topic to go and get that. That's Cartographies of Time. And in that, this sort of data viz golden age kind of started in the late 18th century, around 1750, 1760, 1780. And people were, characterizing data with axes for the first time. And prior to that, humans have been trying to show chronology for hundreds of years, but they just hadn't thought of an axis, right? And this goes back to how amazing it is to use tools today. It's like somebody invented the idea of an axis. There was a time when that didn't exist. And so now you look back at the chronology from the 16th, 15th, and 14th century, and it's trees and it's rivers flowing, representing data. And they're all very beautiful. I mean, but in terms of data representations, they're not great if you're trying to show data, but it's almost like we're swinging around again in the 21st century, and we're trying to now come up with innovative ways to grab people's attention. Maybe we'll see some of those old metaphors. I don't know. I've talked myself out of my own argument. I don't know. Yeah. All right, let's move on. If you disagree with me or agree with me, let me know in the comments. And what have you done? That was index number. That was elegant design. So next we're going to talk about pictures and icons and pictorial elegance. So we've got 2 more charts to go. Then we'll wrap up, and do put more questions in the comments box. All right. Helmets. Tell me about helmets, RJ.
So here is a wacky way of showing time. This is Helmets by Bashford Dean. Bashford Dean was, I believe, the first curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City's Arms and Armor collection. He's also an evolutionary biologist at Columbia University, and you can see the influence of Darwinism and the idea of evolutionary trees crossing over from biology over to human designs. And so he explains the evolution of the helmet, and he does this with an evolutionary tree, but it's even better than that because he actually uses little pictorial depictions of each individual helmet as the marks in this chart. And what I love about this is that from a macro perspective, you can get the sense of the tree evolving. But then from a micro perspective, you can zoom in and you can, with your eye and look at any individual helmet, see its unique, distinctive characteristics, but then also compare it to its neighboring helmets and really see how the form of each helmet evolved. This chart just prompts so many questions. Why did it evolve? Why did certain trees, were they over designed? Were they overly specialized for their time? Did fashion change? Did tools change? Did metallurgy change? Did weapons change? Were individual knights changing their helmets on their own, or were there centralized designers controlling these decisions? There's just so many questions about the history of armor, something I honestly maybe I wasn't very interested in until I saw this chart. And this is one chart that's part of a packet of charts examining different aspects of the knight's suit of armor. I think it's completely beautiful, and also it's something that we've sort of lost the ability to make something like this. Why? Because the skills required to command statistical big data today are not the same skills that make it easy to produce 60 illustrations. I think it's a completely beautiful piece.
Yeah, I do too, and it's going back to that time taken to read some of these old charts. You can imagine sitting down, almost with a childlike curiosity, and following a line and reading it, and then going to another line and reading it there. So I'm going to challenge you, RJ. So yeah, we might have lost the skill to create this kind of thing, but have we not gained much else with the tools that we have that give us, abilities to animate this kind of thing or look at it in different perspectives?
Yeah, so I think that we've gained quite a lot. We've gained quite a lot in terms of, so what is big data? John Tukey had this great definition of big data where he talked about big data being something bigger than what can fit on an individual machine. The great thing that's about that definition is that it works across time. So if think about what your computer machine was in the 1960s versus today, but also works across contexts. And so, my machine working as an independent creative in my own little studio, my machine might be very, very different than your machine working in a big corporation. And so what big data is, though, has absolutely exploded, and the tools we have today helps us grapple with that big data. We've already talked a little bit about interaction, ability to do that, the ability to do things live. And so for most of history, working with data was working with history, meaning data was a shadow of the past that was cast forward to what we are now. But today, we can work with live data, and working with live data it allows us to create almost like a data mirror to society. This live mirror that we can look at and say, how are things going right now? And that's really incredible. It's something that we haven't been able to deal with, that we haven't been able to do before. However, I would contest that there isn't a modern tool out there that can generate something as beautiful as this. And if you could imagine looking at this and replacing each helmet with a circle or a square or some other sort of polygon mark, you just shudder, because it would instantly become unappetizing.
Yeah. Okay, there's a challenge to everybody on this live stream. Prove RJ wrong and show us an equivalent to this drawn in the tool of your choice, or find out somebody else did. We would love to see it, but I think as I develop my own skills and experience and learn how other people have developed their skills, it's like, if you're going to get in the field of data these days, you're going to learn the tools. You're going to learn the basic techniques about pre-attentive attributes. You're going to learn the technology, and then over time, you just build up this muscle memory of how to do the basics. And then this kind of stuff starts encroaching on what you can build, and you see this thing that brings new ideas, and then you go to pen and paper, and it all begins to flow into place. So helmets, and he. You had this slide in the thing. Are these just other examples from the book?
Yeah, so this was a very short pamphlet, and these are all the different evolutionary charts in that pamphlet.
Cool, I love it. All right, so that's helmets and Bashford. Right, before we go on to the last one, we had a question. Do you have a modern day version of these dashboards that we could see? They'd love to leverage them in their work. I like that question.
So, so I'm not sure what is meant by modern day version of these dashboards, but I do have a modern dashboard, which is a guide to not necessarily these examples, but many examples from the history of the craft that are worth familiarizing yourself with, and that will give you not only a sort of easy overview of everything, but will also give you all the links to what's available online in terms of how to view them.
Yeah, I think my answer to that is, I'm just showing on screen an earlier one from Playfair. This is the first, what many people think was the first statistical line chart, and what certainly data viz practitioners know and talk about when they talk about Playfair. The reason I show this is because you can go, well, is there a modern day equivalent of this? And you're like, well, he got it so right. You can just build that in Tableau right now. You can make it interactive, but it's there. It's just a case of taking that annotation idea, taking that color idea, and constructing it yourself, right? That one's easy to rebuild in Tableau because it's a nice basic line chart, right? But the helmet one might be a bit more bespoke. I'm not sure about other versions of the same ones. Right, that's a good question though. Any more questions? Do keep them coming. And now I've lost my slide deck. Does that? I'll just do it this way. All right, next we are still in these this final section. Tell us about the ocean shrinking.
Okay, so the ocean shrinks. This is from a book produced at the very end of World War II, and the point of the book was to show both British and American citizens that, hey, you guys are pretty similar. We're great friends. And it's full of all of these charts from the Isotype Institute, which is really worth looking up if you haven't heard of it. But what it's most famous for is using pictorial icons in charts. So instead of a bar chart, you would have, if you have, you would have little icons next to one another, sort of stacked up. This one is a little bit unique among the isotype work. It's called The Ocean Shrinks, and it shows how, again, the travel time, which is a sort of a callback to the first Chasson travel time cartogram we saw, that the ocean is getting smaller as vehicles are getting faster. And so at a macro level, we can see the ocean shrinking. And we have this almost sort of like a funnel diagram. But there's so many great details in this chart. So the first one is that just marvel at how visual salience is used. So we have this macro pattern, this sort of funnel shape as we march through time. But then you also have the most salient item, which is the vehicle in bright red. And you can see that it's right in the center, but it's been shifted a little bit so that it doesn't run into the gutter of the book. And you can just follow this bright red mark all the way down, and there it is. But if you look at it closely, you can see that the actual pictorial form of the mark is changing. And so we're going from sail to steam, and then finally to an airplane flight. But I thought
it was a whale, actually, when I first saw it. I thought it was a blue whale flying through the sky. and then I thought, no, it's probably an airplane. Right, carry on.
But there's even more design detail. So if we look at the little the footnote, each wave represents 1 day of travel. So actually, there is data here. There are numbers being represented. It's not just a children's picture book. And so you could count the waves and see how many days it took to go from Britain to America. And then the final design detail I think worth highlighting is if you look at these city skylines, they are changing. And so America goes from what looks like maybe a New England mill town all the way to a high-rise city. And then similarly, it looks like St. Paul's and Big Ben, on your side of the pond, and even the factory, is improving, and it's and getting bigger. So I just love all the pictorial detail that's not hidden, but is here, and it's here in a way that doesn't distract you from the big message.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's really, really smart. Fantastic. Right. That is the last of these 6. So we're going to take some questions. I'm just going to stop sharing. We've got a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up and talk about further resources. So first of all, tell us a little bit about how these might have influenced your book. To what extent has this led to Info We Trust, the book?
Sure. So when I wrote the book, I was very strategic in how I researched it. And so the first thing I did before I wrote anything is I read everything written about the craft, all the books, all the pamphlets, all the introductions that I could find, everything written before interactive computer graphics. So all the way up until about 1983, 1984, 1985, I wanted to see what resonated as still true from the history of the craft. Because my assumption was that if it was true in 1882, if I read something from 1882 and it still sounded true, it still rang true with what I knew from my own personal craft, then it was timeless. It would be true for the rest of my life and maybe longer. And so I wanted to pull out all of these sort of design lessons, all these perspectives that I considered timeless. And then what I did is I wrote the first draft of the book. And then only then, once I wrote the first draft of the book in my own voice, that I read everything post 1985, because I didn't, post 1985, these are our colleagues. These are all people, I have personal relationships with. These are people who have very strong voices, very strong perspectives. And I needed to polish the book based on their input, but I couldn't let their voice sway my narrative too much. I wanted my narrative to be to come out of the intersection of this historic craft and my own experience working today.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, thank you. And then we've had another question. I'm going to go to my bookshelf to answer this one, but it says, I'm interested in the history of data visualization. hurrah, hurrah, hurrah.
Yeah.
I'm delighted. But then the question is, what books should I start with? I'm just going.
Oh,
You start, RJ. I'm just going to get these books.
oh, so I think the best book to start with, if you want a paper book, I think the best book to start with is one that is about to be published. So Sandra Rengren for Taschen is publishing a giant history of infographics, and it's coming out like at the end of this month, and I'm so excited to get it. The cover art was just released. It looks beautiful. That if you're gonna buy only one, I would say buy that one. However, so my library is actually in another room, but I have only one book on my shelf, and you can see it in the background, and it's this red book. I don't know if we can show my screen or not.
If you're talking, everybody should be able to see you.
Oh, great. Okay, so it's this red book all the way at the top shelf, and that's a book that which is Playfair's Atlas and Breviary, and I think it is the most important book to own. I don't think it's the best data viz history book. I think it's the best data viz book. Period. if you haven't not only familiarized yourself with the charts, I mean the charts are interesting, but read his writing, read his explanations of what he's trying to accomplish, of what he's doing, what he's after, how it works. It's just I think it's the best book and absolutely essential.
Yeah, absolutely. I would wholly agree with those. I think what else would I say? I would say this one was a huge influence for me. This is Cartographies in Time. So it's a history of the timeline. And if you've seen me do my how should we visualize time talk, a lot of the historical stuff came from that one. Menard, who I love. This is Sandra Rengren's one of her other books. This is the Menard system. And this is every chart that Menard ever did. That's awesome. But the history of infographics is going to be huge. I'll just share my screen for one last recommendation. Let's go back to this one. You can go very far down the rabbit hole by just hunting around on archive.org. So what we're looking at here is a spread from Willard Branson's book in 1911, not from 1914, and they're all there. So just dig around, find the books that you can, and then a lot of them are on archive.org. One new resource that I would recommend to a lot of people, if I can grab the right icon, is on Slack. There is the Data Visualization Society. You can join this Slack channel. There's thousands of people on this channel now, and in there there's a channel on historical viz. That's what's on screen now, and there are 450 other geeks sharing all the old visualizations they are finding. And it's amazing. And there's Sandra's new book that RJ shared yesterday. That's coming in. I'm very excited.
Andy, while you're on that Slack channel, can you bring up the link at the top of it? So there's a Google Doc link at the very top of that thread, like very, very top. Yeah, there you go. And so this is a list that I put together, and it is going to catalog all of the interesting reading about historic viz. And you'll see that a lot of these are those archive links that Andy was talking about. And so this is just a nice handy collection to go to. And then Andy, can you show the scroll info?
Yes,
we trust. Yep. Because that's another way to sort of navigate this history and I think a pretty fun way.
Yeah, this is when I was saying earlier about how we used to do things in visual metaphors and now we do things in line charts. I was realizing we were going to show this at the end, and I was like, well, here's a really enticing, engaging way to look at time, which is no longer in an axis but actually in an old style. So that's why I was hesitating earlier. I'll also say I totally recommend everybody goes buys Sandra's book, just so you know. It's going to be this big, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the other Taschen books. This is not foreshortening. This is literally bigger than my head. But they're amazing. So so go check that one out. But do also we both have books. You can go buy those as well. Right. I believe we have answered all the questions. It's time to say thank you. Yeah, RJ, thank you so much for taking us through the history of data viz today. It's brilliant getting an insight into what's going on in your head. So thank you very much. Also, thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Thanks for the comments and questions. We will probably try to put more resources, links to resources on Facebook in the Tableau software channel, either below this video or in a different post. But otherwise, we hope we've inspired some of you to go and check out a little bit more about the history of data visualization. With that, thanks, RJ.
Thank you, Andy.
We will see you all again very soon. Take care. Goodbye.